Hi, my name is Maddy Clifford. I also go by MADlines, and I'm a teaching artist. I work independently. One of the main sites where I work is the San Francisco Juvenile Justice Center, which is a short-term youth detention facility for the city and county of San Francisco. And I'm really all about using creativity and hip-hop lyricism and spoken word to bring young people into the magic of literacy itself.
My name is Shakur. I've been incarcerated for close to 33 years for a gang-related murder that resulted in the retaliatory deaths of my mother and little brother. I'm also in prison for kidnapping, robbery, and sexual assault. Since I've been down, I'm a trained restorative justice practitioner, a circle process keeper, and I facilitate a number of groups.
My name is Ariel Luckey. I'm an interdisciplinary artist, a father, community member, organizer, educator, maybe advocate, so many hats. Born and raised in Oakland, California. I've lived here all my life. And I primarily think of myself as a storyteller and have a wide variety of mediums in which I use story to gather people and maybe make some change along the way.
My name is NaTisha Hutson. I am a restorative justice practitioner. I am a mediator, a youth advocate, an educator, a lot of things. I grew up in the Bay Area, originally from the South, so both of those environments have informed who I am and my perspective. Though getting into education was not my plan originally, or doing community work, honestly, I can't see myself doing anything other than that.
Greetings, my name is Russell Shoatz III. My father is a U.S. held political prisoner, Russell Maroon Shoatz, and he has been incarcerated now since 1971 and has spent over 20 years in solitary confinement. My father started out with the Black Panther Party, the Black Unity Council, and also was a member in the Black Liberation Army. They did expropriations from banks and food centers in order to feed the hungry and disenfranchised people in the Black community of Philadelphia. My father's case revolves around an Amadou Diallo style shooting of police brutality where a young man was shot by police officers here in Philadelphia during the Rizzo administration in front of his mother and dragged out in the streets, and the community was in an outrage. So my father and 5 of his comrades went to retaliate on a police station in West Philadelphia in a place called Cobbs Creek, and at the end of that evening, a police officer lay dead. Eventually, they all were caught, and they never actually told who the gunman was, and so they all were sentenced to life sentences.
Theoretically, I've never been for prisons. I've never, I learned a lot about the PIC, prison industrial complex, from a young age. When I was about a teenager up in Seattle, Washington, I was in part of a lot of youth advocacy groups. So I think in theoretical terms, I was always really, I felt that there was a lot of alternatives to locking people away. But I think in a practical sense, being there, it not only did it reiterate those theoretical ideas, but interacting with people that were being traumatized, particularly young people, particularly adolescents in this really important stage of their development, just really cemented, my belief in abolition and also my belief that creativity, art, are some of the ways that we can respond to harm and reduce harm and interrupt cycles of violence in our communities and in the world.
Perpetrators of crime are just locked away and being devalued without really trying to understand why they committed the act in the first place. Then there would never be any type of healing. But maybe that we can sit down and we can dialogue, we can talk about the various, things that occurred in our lives when survivors of crime can have an opportunity to speak and vent their feelings.
developed a relationship with Karina Gould, who is a Chochenyo Ohlone local leader, a brilliant, visionary, amazing, dedicated community organizer, and just phenomenal human being. And so when her and her good friend Janella LaRose were starting Segurate Land Trust, which is really the first urban indigenous women-led land trust in the country that we're aware of, led by indigenous women with the project of reclaiming stolen Ohlone land here in the Bay Area. Arguably one of the more inflated real estate markets in the country, if not the world. And the Ohlone right now are not federally recognized. They don't have a land base. They are completely politically marginalized. So I was so inspired by their vision for Segurate, and that it felt like a natural place for me to plug in and just figure out, like, how can I help? I've lived on this land my entire life. I've benefited from, the Spanish colonization, the gold rush, the Mexican-American War, like all of these historical things that have shaped the Oakland that we live in now that, for the most part, we take for granted. We walk through the city, there are buildings, there are public infrastructure, it's all here. But my life has been, completely operating within that paradigm, within this landscape of the city. And so I feel like it's my responsibility, it's part of my relationship to help kind of free some of this earth from the private property, from the profit-driven business orientation, the gentrification, the condo boom, the tech boom, all of these things that are more of the same kind of colonial patterns, more of the same kind of exploitive relationships. Karina and Janella and Segurate Land Trust have a different vision for what the Bay Area can look like. That's about community, that's about open green space, that's about restoring Ohlone sacred sites and sacred rituals and community vibrancy. And that's kind of the Bay that I want to be a part of making.
Let's just say the Bay Area as a community, as someone who was raised here, pretty much lived here my whole life. I think I'll know when the Bay Area is healing when there is more acceptance and less tolerance. I feel that people kind of tolerate things, lifestyles, people of particular race, ethnicities, cultures. I think about just the gentrification that is going on and how there are streets that have historically been like low income Black and brown folks for the most part, and now you have kind of like these white hipsters moving in, or the white middle and upper class. They walk by, they don't speak, like they just have no kind of acknowledgement for the people and the communities that were there before them, and that there was a culture in the Bay Area before them. And so there's kind of like tolerance of, yeah, I'll move here, or I will live here amongst these people, but that's it. And I won't try to understand them. I won't make space for them to try to understand me. And like I said, you can just feel that.
Young people from these communities in the Bay Area that have made San Francisco what it is, the Mission, talking about the Fillmore, Hunters Point, Potrero Hill, the list goes on, and all these communities that are hoods that are like pushed aside, but have made San Francisco cracking and popping and even worth living in as a city, right? And so being able to write verses back and forth with these young people and their families, the traditions, and being able to also encourage them, you need to keep telling the story of where you're from and where you're going and those kind of things.
I've been doing work over the past 25 years around my father's and others' cases, and just around human rights and human justice issues in general. Throughout that work, there has been a thread of resistance. Obviously, there's been a thread of freedom fighters. There's been a thread of people willing to risk their life to obtain that equality, that justice. Folks have held on to those ideologies beyond their abilities to be strengths, and almost to the point of where there are weaknesses to our community, specifically in the context of healing. Definitely the ideas around militarisms, the ideas of machismo, or ideas around men being a priority. These ideas are not only outdated, but they definitely don't work in human rights struggles today. And the interesting piece is that those who were the vanguard of the 60s attest to this and are saying it for the most part loud and clear, but for whatever reasons, people rely on those ideas and ideologies from the 60s, and they're more sexier than the new ideas, but at the same time, the new ideas are more effective.
So I want to talk about, okay, how do we model restorative justice principles at a micro scale within our personal lives as we advocate for it structurally on a macro level? Okay, for this real question, I think it's really important to understand, first of all, that restorative justice is a way to do justice that it actively includes the people impacted. So in my mind, there's a tier of victimization, right? And with that tier, just imagine there's the person who was harmed. Then you have that person's family. Then you have the community. At the fourth tier you have is your family. And the fifth is the victim. So I think it's important to first of all understand this just understand that aspect of victimization, right? And it's important also to realize that people and their relationships, they must be repaired in order for justice and healing to be realized.
I think accountability is hard, and it's hard to practice on an interpersonal level. It's super hard to create on a systems level. You could, in a large part, the criminal justice system is a failed system of accountability, and it's failing in so many ways. A lot of times, I don't even know what it looks like on when you scale out, you scale up. I think accountability is in part about power, and I think what we're trying to do with Segorite Land Trust is build a power base that can be at the table, that can be on the field, that Ohlone people and native folks in the Bay in general have been so marginalized politically and economically that it's in order to have any kind of real process of accountability, it's a rebalancing. It's to me, part of it is about centering and space. So for me as a white man in this world, I know that my experience has been centered in a certain kind of way, and that part of that rebalancing is about me stepping back, making space, supporting, and having other folks in the lead?
For me, one of the most important aspects of restorative justice is boundary setting. People think boundary setting is about like creating like borders and barriers, but it's really about understanding yourself and what your own boundaries are. And it's actually a practice of love. I think people use love in one dimensional sense of like, oh, it's like blissful and happy, and I think love actually can be is very fierce.
The challenges with restorative justice adaptation or implementation is that people are not spending enough time thinking about it. They just want to do it. Or those who are responsible for people adopting it and implementing it aren't given enough time to allow people to really think about it. And so people are trying to do something that they haven't even conceptualized. They don't even know what they're doing.
I don't like to try to define, what restorative justice looks like, because I actually think that it looks like a bunch of different things for different scenarios and different people. But one thing that I know that it's not white people defining that definition. It's not white people creating that narrative. It is the victims who actually create the narrative of what restorative justice is and what actually helps them to be restored. And I think that's lacking in the whole restorative justice conversation, even in those terms, restorative justice, because a lot of the victims not only don't hear that or feel that or can relate to that, but that's not their language. They didn't develop that language. That language didn't come from them. So when you talk restorative justice to them, there's a disconnect. And until they are able to create the narrative, name the dialogue, say what the terms are and which define them, then it'll be that disconnect, and the healing won't happen in the way in which it should.
In my opinion, accountability, it requires like a full understanding of the crime or its impact that it has had on survivors, and there is no one way that we can gain this understanding, because it can come through various aspects. It can come through talking with the person who was harmed. It can come through like reading a victim impact statement or survivors of crime impact statement. It can come through listening to others share their stories. It may come in part by understanding one's own experience of being victimized. And the reason why I say that's important is because when a person who offends or a person who perpetrates a crime, it's important to understand, like, okay, why did this person do this, right?
And you have to be able to step outside of your comfort zone and say, wow, I am a person who has caused harm to someone else. And I think what's difficult about that is, for some people, if I'm a person that has caused harm, what does that mean about me? What does that mean about the kind of person I am versus the kind of person I think I am? And people don't want to do that kind of self-reflective work, so they'll just stay away from it altogether.
The biggest piece also is for, folks to know that they are also accountable and responsible for their narratives and for kind of saying, hey, I live in a community. I actually am a victim. It wasn't just some random act of violence that happens all of the time in the hood. No, I've been victimized. I've had something taken away from me. I need to heal in another way besides Cousin Luckey going back and retaliating. And we have families doing that and saying that, but those families also need to be supported internally in our communities and not shunned and looked upon as weak because Mookie didn't go and retaliate against the other's family. I don't feel like there's enough support, especially internally in neighborhoods when people are not anti-retributive, and when, grandmama's reaching out to the other people's family and saying, it's a shame that your grandson killed my grandson, but we should go to church together, or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. And as weird and unorthodox as that may sound, coming from a victim's family, if that's, what it is, and we should all kind of jump in and try to support grandma in her way of trying to be healed, and that shouldn't be a narrative that's looked upon negatively. It just should be a narrative, just one of the many that may come out of it.
My community as a Black person, and because of government and state violence, it is fractured. And though we are a community, we are a community that has been denied healing for so long. And because of that denial of our healing, it has prevented us from coming together in ways that are most impactful and much needed, desperately needed. But we are working from such a deficit because of white supremacy and how it has impacted us, not even just in this country, but around the world. There's just a lot of work to be done. I know that though we are a very strong community, there is also a delicacy that needs to be taken into consideration. That is often not taken into consideration and not offered up.
But when young people are being ushered into adolescence in like a jail cell, like that's not gonna necessarily like help them. Like some young people, some individuals might use that experience to like write an album, or might reflect on the harm they've caused. And when I say that, though, it's also important to take note that there's a gamut of why young people are in juvenile hall, and it's really problematic to assume just because a young person is in juvenile hall they've committed harm, because that's not necessarily the case. There's certain laws that make it so that young people are more likely to be incarcerated, and I do see a lot of young people that are like transforming and like making this decision, like I'm going to change. But then also it can be really disheartening because they can have a personal like desire to want to change, but if the systems that are in place are set up so that there are no social safety nets, then they can try as much as they can, but honestly a lot of them are set up to fail, and that's the reality of the situation. And if we continue to operate as if that's not, then it puts all of the blame on young people of color, particularly young Black youth. Mm-hmm. And it's really, really not okay.
So I can recall when I was 14 years old, and I was looking for acceptance from my peers, and I committed a crime against a person. It was attempted robbery. I attempted to snatch a woman's purse. 14 years old, I wasn't able to get the purse from her, but I was arrested as a result. I ended up going to court. I went to juvenile hall as a result, and I ended up in the boys' club. But the thing is, to this very day, I don't remember like what that person's name was. I don't remember like how old she was. I don't remember, what she looked like or anything of that matter. So I propose, so I would say, so on a micro scale within my personal life, right? So I'm talking about, so this is my experience, going through the court system, being a perpetrator of crime, creating survivors of crime, and not really realizing the harm that I was causing as a result. So I can imagine if as a young boy, at age 14, when I committed that act of violence, to be able to sit across from this person and, this call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded. To have her chew me out or express to me what was going on with her, like the fear that she may have been experiencing, the way that she may feel like moving forward in her life when she sees people walking down the street, when she's out alone. You have 60 seconds remaining. Just expressing that to me, I think that it could have really impacted my life. So it's my belief that if we were to institute these type of principles on a structure within the court system, that it may make a huge difference in the lives of a lot of youth.
So yeah, I would say storytelling is perhaps one of the most important parts of healing, and however a young person is like approaching their healing process through telling their story, or telling the story of their ancestors, or telling the story of a future that they're dreaming of. It's like they're putting together the puzzle pieces in their memory and in their mind, and sometimes that might mean this happened to me and it was wrong and it really hurt me, and sometimes that can be a really healing process. But not every young person is going to share that, and they don't have to. Like, sometimes it might be writing about a cat, or their favorite basketball game, or I think it's really important that young people are able to be children and have fun and be playful. So that's a really important aspect too of storytelling, especially when it comes to young people.
I think of story as kind of the building blocks of meaning, and how we understand the world and how we understand ourselves and relationships. Security Land Trust has a new story for the Bay Area, as a what I think is could be a global model of reclamation of open green space, of restorative justice and healing and accountability, of reparations, of redistributing a land base that has been taken from a people and taken from a culture. And the story was kind of interrupted and changed and distorted, and now it might be able to come back in a full circle kind of way. That's a really inspiring story for me, and is one that has led me to dedicate a lot of my life towards making it happen. So.
I think the role of storytelling and healing in my work is imperative, because people connect to stories, and that's how we get to know one another on an empathetic level, because you humanize yourself and your experience, and you open people up to the lens by which you look at the world and how your perceptions are shaped. And it's a very vulnerable thing, and that's also where the breakthrough happens, when people are allowed to tell their stories. I've been in countless restorative processes where someone breaks down crying, or they get really vulnerable and share something, and that hits the facilitators and everyone else in the room, and people start to lighten up. The tension kind of dissipates, and then other people start being vulnerable. But with the absence of story and storytelling, I don't think we can truly get to know one another. And if we don't truly know one another, that makes it very difficult to separate the person from the behavior. If you can't separate the person from the behavior, you can't have a restorative process.
It has like a profound impact on people. It helps them get things out. It assists them in making sense of crime's impact and its causes. So when people they can talk about their experiences, they can receive like honor and validation. That's really important. So for the victim, it can it can help them get out, what's inside them. It can also put the crime into perspective, and it can make sense of their reaction. And some personal ways that can take place for a survivor of crime. It can be journaling. It can be poetry. It can be painting. It can be talking with family. It can be talking with friends. It can be talking with therapists. Person can do it like through public means. They can attend rallies. They can also advocate for a change in legislation. And with storytelling and having avenues such as this, you can also give a person who has been harmed a feeling of vindication, that they're being heard, that it's not their fault. So storytelling and venting, expressing one's feelings from a survivor of crime perspective is really important.
And so there was a call for a Mother's Day rally that I was the host and MC, put together by prisoners, juvenile lifers. And the idea was that we would take caskets up to the prison and let the DA know that these are the bodies of, the juvenile lifers that died in prison already and the ones scheduled to die, and that PA has more juvenile lifers in prison than some countries have in their whole prison system, X, Y, Z. So the juvenile lifers said, no, we'd rather you guys take flowers to the DA and cards and, tell them to think about these cards and give them to their mothers and give the mothers of the DA flowers so that they could think about if possibly their son was in a situation that I was in where they can't see their mom and they had to send flowers from prison and cards, homemade cards to their mom because they doing life. They made a mistake. They didn't have no way to repent, and the state is retributive against them. And no matter what they do, even if they reached out to the family and the family, said it was okay and felt that, they didn't want to be retributive and it was okay to come home, the state still said, you're assigned to life, you're doing life. So we said, that's the craziest strategy. We're not doing that. But we submitted to doing what the inside strategists from the prisoners who we saying we fighting for, that's what they wanted to do. We did it. And in that process, I end up having a nervous breakdown. And that nervous breakdown translated to, it was the one safe space that I had been in probably the 25 years of my organizing. And that was with a bunch of mothers of juvenile lifers, with a bunch of flowers. It looked like a funeral or something in there. And just really peaceful setting. All of the other rallies and things I've always been to. I've always been fully armored, ideologically and externally. In the past, I may have come with weapons on me or whatever. I may be looking for the cops. I may have something to cover my face with tear gas. And ideologically, what I found is that I didn't have my armor on, and it was a safe space for emotionally for me to be able to cry and have a good time with some women who I knew had my back. Even though I was supposed to be emceeing the thing, I couldn't MC. I ended up in a corner in tears with a bunch of mothers just, holding me and getting me back together in order to MC. And again, we can't ever get to those spaces of vulnerability if we almost always have our armor on, and especially internally. And then we're definitely not going to do it externally if we are always armored up. If we go to the state armored up and say, state, we want you to release our people, we've done that, and that's not the only strategy. That's not the worst way. We can continue doing that also. But if we go outside the box, we may actually find that something happens different inside of us, and that those actions aren't external from us. All of our militant actions towards the state aren't external to us and actually have some effect on us. And when we go out there, we can't just think about the state. We got to think about us too.